And I'll send a link to the recording in the follow-up email and the slides that Rochelle is going to share. So you guys will have that information. And then if you've got questions, be sure to put them in chat, and I'm going to monitor the chat. And hopefully we'll have time at the end, but if we don't, then if the questions were not answered during the session, then we'll get back to you with an answer. So just a little bit about ESA before we get started. For the past 7 years, we've partnered with ADP to build this executive community of nearly 3,000 participants in almost 20 cities, delivering world-class thought leadership and exposure to innovative technologies that are shaping the future of work. And we're unique. We're a unique network in that we bring CHROs, CIOs, CMOs, CFOs, and other work tech executives together because we believe that they all have to be in lockstep with each other to deliver the kind of worker experience necessary to attract and retain talent, especially now. Today, I want to share more details of our board positioning membership, and that provides many of the resources an executive needs to begin and navigate their perfect board seat. I always say it's a great place to start when you really don't know what you want to do. And so after launching this program last year, we added some resources and changed our pricing structure based on the feedback that we received from last year's participants. And by the way, at least 4 of our members have landed board positions already because of this program. So the board positioning membership provides resources in a couple of areas. One, those that are covered in the ESA cost, and those include quarterly sessions moderated by Carrie Miller of Overton VC that highlight startups that are part of their portfolio. And she's brought on this year several other VCs into the program, and they really help executives in our program transition their enterprise skills to the startup world. Secondly, we offer at least quarterly work tech innovation lab sessions, and these are facilitated by Targeted Velocity, and they advise startups on how to use the startup board and will help proactively recommend our BPM board positioning members for startup board roles and facilitate these innovation lab sessions. And then finally, we've curated monthly sessions. These are hourly sessions every month with experienced board members sharing their experience on both being selected and serving on a board, and consulting firms that share information a board member should understand on current board topics being discussed in the boardroom. And those include AI, geopolitical and cybersecurity risks, digital transformation, board-level discussions around mergers and acquisitions, and how to quantify human capital. So those are some of the topics that are covered in the every month exclusive sessions. And then we also offer access to additional resources that we've curated that are available at a special rate for our members. One, membership in the Private Directors Association, and that's really valuable, you guys. And the first year of being a board positioning member, you get a 20% discount on the PDA Association's cost. Branding packages are offered by Coursant Technologies, and they include podcasts and help with LinkedIn presence. And last but not least, coaching, board resume preparation, and a detailed board navigation plan is offered by Rochelle Campbell of Leadership Elevated. Rochelle, and we're so excited to have her with us today. She is the CEO and managing member of Leadership of Elevated. She's an accomplished board advisor, recruiter, DE&I thought leader, columnist, and speaker. She's had a successful career supporting boards and executives across industry and sizes. Rochelle spent almost a decade with the National Association of Corporate Directors, where she led the NACD board advisory and board recruitment practice. And she's placed directors on boards ranging from the Fortune 500 to large family-owned private and nonprofit organizations. She's amazing, you guys. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rochelle to share the things that you should consider as you start your board journey. Rochelle, it's all yours.
Thank you, Cindy. That was a wonderful introduction. And this is a really great program. I've been working with Cindy on some of these sessions for like 9 months now, and it's just been a delight. As Cindy mentioned, I spent over a decade with the National, or almost rather a decade with the National Association of Corporate Directors. And now I run my own practice where I work with executives looking to be placed on boards and work with boards looking to find candidates and governance education. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the program. The reason why I underscore that is because all of the information that I bring to you about how to think about joining your first corporate board is because I have deep experience from the recruiting side. And so that's how I think about these things as it relates to you, each of you taking your next step. So let me just jump in really fast. The first thing is that about 85% of all board roles are placed through personal and professional networking. Oh, I think I'm having some PowerPoint problems. Hold on one second. There we go. Oh, all right. So about 85% of all board roles are placed through personal and professional networking. Networking is really the most important thing you can do. And organizations like EAS is really the right way to be able to position yourself. And to be able to position yourself, you have to understand what's important to a board and understand how your career aligns to what's important to a board. I go through this list of 8 ways to prepare yourself, but this is just top line as it relates to other ways you'll be working with Cindy through her programming in terms of board positioning. So let me start with why networking is so important. I mentioned 85% of board roles are placed through personal and professional networking. Only about 15% go through recruiters, but it does happen. And so you want to make sure that you're playing both sides of that situation at the same time, and that you're positioning yourself so that no matter how somebody comes into you, you are prepared and ready. So understanding governance structures, we'll talk some about that later, but really making sure that you have aligned your—
Rochelle, we lost you. We lost your video or audio.
I'm here.
No,
she said she was having some computer problems when she got online. So
Rochelle, I hear you.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. All right.
Sorry. Okay. So I mentioned, I'm sorry, 85% of boards, so personal and professional networking. So 15% does come through recruiting, and somewhere in that 85, we sort of the top 20% of that is some hybrid version of networking and board recruiting. So if you're thinking about board service, if it's something you want to pursue, the number one thing you'll do, the very first step, is to develop your board resume, bio, and LinkedIn profile. The reason why you do this is because it really helps you get clear inside yourself on what your value is to board so that you can communicate that. It also can be a laborious process. For some people, it's really emotional. It can be very frustrating. I am a board recruiter, and I remember a few years ago when I was doing my resume, I had given it to a friend of mine, a colleague who I'd worked with for years, and she looked at it and said it was terrible. And I couldn't understand why it was terrible, and we talked through it. But the reality is, even though I'm a board recruiter, I also get attached to my own the things that I find important, things that I find valuable. And the idea is that in writing your board resume, you're really focusing on what a board finds valuable. So getting all that information out. So first get it all onto paper, and then to start really striking and reorganizing for boards. Boards are not focused on what you manage. They don't care as much about inputs. What they care about is outcomes. So organizing your resume in a way that makes sense, that help boards understand your value through your outcomes. So they're not going to bring you in, let me just start that a board's role is oversight. They're not going to bring you in to lead something, although leading is helpful. They're certainly not going to bring you in to manage something. What they're looking for is oversight structures. So they take the outcomes in which you have created and can determine that because you created outcomes here, you'll understand the oversight, hopefully, and be able to ask really good questions in the boardroom. So again, developing that work first on your resume, on your paper resume that you are, that really demonstrates all in a chronology, all of the things that are important to a board, your exact history. I am not a fan of the types of documents that kind of cut things up and rearrange them, because the reality is, if you tell me that you on one column was a manager and then later a C-suite leader, and on another column you were a with a small cap company and a Fortune 500 company, then I have to go try and figure out where you did each one of those things. And boards want to recruit directly for typically a trajectory, typically against multiple skill sets that follow a pathway that makes sense for their strategy. So having a clear resume with the right keywords in it, we always want to search engine optimize for that. Once you have your resume, you'll want to then create your board bio. And from there, you'll go and create your LinkedIn profile. And really what you're doing is just taking your resume and cutting and pasting onto your LinkedIn profile so that there is consistency across information. So when boards, I mentioned, are recruiting 85% of the time through their networking, typically what happens is that someone might go to a board and say, let's say a board is recruiting, they might say to go to their network first and say, hey, network, we're looking to recruit. Do you know anyone who's a CFO in manufacturing and currently sits on a board? Well, that might just be the first level. And then they might get 20 resumes that are friends that have CFOs that have sat in manufacturing. They're also going to look for revenue. So does the revenue match? Meaning boards want to recruit hires. So if you have, just pretend $100 million in revenue experience, they're looking for often 200 to 500 million. If you have $500 million in revenue experience, they're going to be looking to recruit. If the company is that much, they're looking to recruit higher. The idea is the company wants the experience that allows them to increase their current revenue to be able to grow as an organization. And typically, not always, but almost always, board members that don't have the same revenue aren't as helpful in the oversight process to help boards grow. I mentioned boards' roles oversight, but it's also strategy. It's not execution. It's approving, monitoring, and understanding and goaling against the strategy, essentially. So what they want to understand when they're recruiting is, do you have the understanding of where these goals should be aligned, of the questions we should be asking, of the issues we might face as we grow, which is why, again, they almost always go up in revenue. So revenue, functional role, special skills, board work is another thing. So on your board resume, you're going to want to think about your board work. If you don't have board work, you need to go find board work. We say it takes a board role to get a board role. I've placed a number of candidates on their first corporate board because they had current nonprofit board experience that they clearly defined, and it was a reasonable nonprofit. So an HOA board is not the best nonprofit, but something is better than nothing. Your local shelter might be a great option. Your local Boys and Girls Club is a great option. There's all kinds of nonprofits that can be small in scale, but sufficient in structure. And so if you're joining a nonprofit board for the first time, to be able to get towards your first corporate board, make sure that you're joining the finance committee or that you're joining the treasuries, because really what we see happen is where there is money, there is typically more structure and oversight. So it demonstrates your skills, a little more consistency. And what they're looking for as well is, at the executive role, at the executive level, if you have worked with boards, even if you're delivering to boards, even if you're sitting in boardrooms or monitoring, you're still not the it and all decision maker. And so even if you're on a nonprofit, you demonstrate that even in that role, you were actually left to hold the bag and make the decisions and ensure oversight, and that you had to demonstrate that small group dynamics work. And that's really what they're looking for. So resume structure should include board resume or board information right up front, a chronology of your executive roles, special skills. I always love the about section. An about section in a resume is helpful to center a candidate, to make them approachable, to humanize them. Doesn't matter what it is. So it could be, married or kids or travel or interests or hobbies. I worked on a board search with a grocery store, and they were moving into the healthy living space. And so I found candidates that met all of their needs, their functional roles, their revenue, their special skills, their industry. But then we looked for candidates that had written in the about section, which is usually just, again, a sentence or two, that their hobbies were running or outdoor life or, something that was sort of healthy living. And that helped me sort out the tens of thousands of potential candidates to find the right 10 candidates, 20 candidates to send to that board to ensure they got what they needed out of it. So having that about section can be really helpful in helping a boards distinguish that you are the right candidate for them, or that, you know, it just gives them a little more information about you, helps them ask more questions, those kinds of things. Okay, so let me pause for a minute and say that this is meant to be a helpful conversation to you. So if you have any questions throughout, don't hesitate to reach your hand, or raise a hand or jump in, come off mute. All of that's fine with me. Okay, so number 2 in terms of preparing for board service is to assess your skill sets, understand your value. So boards, again, they're looking for oversight, they're looking for board work, they're looking for traditional skill sets. It is not helpful for you to, and I'm sorry, I said traditional skill sets, but really they're also looking for interesting and new trending skill sets, and those titles change. So assessing your value for a CFO 20 years ago might have looked like audit, lots of things, and also audit. And now it might look like lots of things. Maybe a few years later, it went from audit to risk management to enterprise risk management to just ERM. So that's a great example of being able to transition that language throughout your documents into something that is searchable now, that is skill set relevant, and that can help a board find you. The other thing is, we're talking about revenue. Again, revenue is important. Technology is important. There's all of these new things coming up. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which monitors public company boards across the primary, or across all public companies actually, has set out regulation for cybersecurity guidance. They're changing rules all of the time. They had last year alone, I think it was 30 plus rules up for change. So really understanding how that looks against your resume and against your value can change. So a few years ago, boards thought cybersecurity was maybe interesting, but not as focused on it. They're now getting more focused on it. So that's something that you'll want to spend more time talking about. Another way to think about your skill set is really in a T, and we call it a T section, where you want to think about your functional role, which is, again, whatever that looks like, COO, CEO, CHRO, CIO, whatever that looks like. But then you'll also want to think about it from a strategy perspective. So a board's role is to look at the entire organization and make decisions. So part of that is, let's just say your functional role is a CIO. As a CIO, do you understand departmental strategy? Do you understand the strategy of the entire organization? Can you, in that CIO role, ask good questions about how that interplays with finance and talent and supply chain and everything else? And that's where the T comes in. So being able to talk about your skill sets, not just from your functional role, which is important, but your overall oversight, your overall strategy, your overall leadership are important as well. And then you want to align that with potential boards. So and then thinking about that strategy will also help you add words to that. So another way to think about that is from a CHRO perspective. It's not just hiring and firing. It can be talent development. It can be talent transfer, talent pool transformation, which is really important right now. I've placed a number of CHROs with those particular skill sets, particularly in manufacturing, heavy industry, where they're trying to figure out how to create talent pool development programs, trying to create retention programs and early pipeline programs. So figuring out how that looks for your industry and how your industry is changing, and making sure all of that language is in there as well. All right, once you've assessed your skill set, so you've figured out that you are a CHRO with talent pool transformation in a $500 million company, that you currently are on a board, and that you've helped companies transform or acquire or integrate other businesses, then you go to your next step, which is to develop and execute a strategic plan. I've said at least 3 times now that 85% of board roles come through personal and professional networking, which means that your strategic plan has to be organized around that. It takes most people somewhere between 2 to 4 years of strategic networking to find their first paid board role. And then from that, it takes, when you sort of restart that cycle again with a slightly different value proposition, and start that process again in terms of networking. So the networking looks, a strategic plan and executing it can look something like deciding that you're going to meet one new executive level person a week, which can be hard, but doable for anyone. That you're going to find a way to be able to share your value. that you are going to get a coach, whether that's an executive coach or a board coach or just an accountability partner that you can communicate that with, that you can share your process with, that you can check in with, to be able to actually say that you're working towards your goal. Now, once you've decided what that plan looks like and you've got your coach, then you're going to want to start networking. And I say network, but we all know that's a terrible word and nobody actually likes networking. I want you to rethink the networking position into building community, finding allies, finding people who want to support you and want you to succeed. So that can be reaching out to other, colleagues. That can be getting buy-in from your board. If you currently are sitting with a company and you have a board, sometimes you have to work to get buy-in from them. That can look like figuring out ways to communicate in small group dynamics in sessions like this, or in in-person meetings, or with the Chamber of Commerce or any other board organization, any other diversity organization or industry organization, finding ways to communicate with them, finding ways to ask lots of questions. People love to be asked questions. So being able to ask questions, I would say 2 ears, 1 mouth, use them in the same proportion, ask questions, listen, find ways to communicate your value in that, find ways to drop in something about something interesting that you've been doing and telling a story about yourself that is memorable, that people can attach to, that they can hold on to. And so that in 6 months or a year or 2 years, when they hear about a board role that they need somebody for, they remember to reach out to you because of some interesting story that you've told. So let me pause that for a minute and just say, I mentioned the 2 to 4 years. The reason why that takes so long is you have to have met enough people, and usually that takes a year or 2, and shared your value with enough people. Usually that takes a year or 2 because we all have lives and jobs often, and family and friends and things we're doing in between. And then those people have to know you. They have to know a board that's ready. Boards only meet quarterly or up to 5 times a year, typically. So once a board has decided they want to start recruiting, usually what happens is that somebody will say they might be rolling off, or they might be aging out, which doesn't happen as often. Or maybe a conflict of interest might arise at some point based off of a new strategy or something to that effect. A board will talk about recruiting for 1 quarter. Usually they might decide they're actually going to recruit. So then you're 6 months in, and then they might do call for proposals, or just do some reviews of current companies they're working with. And then, so then you're another 3 months in, they might execute the search, and then searches take between my searches are 3 to 6 months. Most corporations are somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 months for traditional search leaders. So it can take a whole nother year. So we're sort of up to 2.5 years now from the time a company has even started thinking about wanting to recruit to when they actually place their candidates. So that's why part of the networking process is so long, because you have to meet enough people so that you have cast a wide enough net that when that one particular thing comes up, that you are there. I do a lot with candidates. I also do reverse search, which we haven't talked about yet, but reverse search is where candidates pay me to be their advocate. Essentially, it's not quite search. And in that process, I was talking to somebody. This woman had, from a 15-point criteria, I was working with this company, she had 14 points. But the 1 point that she didn't have for this company was part of a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. And because of that, she didn't make the cut, but that company now knows her for future reference. But that means that, like, all of those pieces of criteria have to come up at the right time, in the right place, in the right person, which is why the networking wide is so important. And if you have built a strong brand, if you have strong allies, if you have, colleagues and friends and family that you've communicated with, they're typically willing to I don't want to say take a bet on you, but they're typically willing to be your advocate and put their name out for you. And if you have been a good employee, if you have managed your brand, if you followed through on the things that you said you were going to follow through on, it's really it's a way for you to be able to demonstrate that you're ready for the boardroom. So manage your brand now while you're in your executive careers. All right, number 5 is to develop your social media presence. So what this means is really getting out on social media. So whether you're sitting in a rural community or in a major city, having a clear social media presence is important. That can look like being able to communicate your LinkedIn profile well. That can look like communicating, posting things on LinkedIn, responding to things on LinkedIn, following people who have strong board presence on LinkedIn. Cindy's a great example in terms of following somebody with a strong board presence. Commenting on things that she's sharing, reposting things. That's a great way to think about your social media profile. Another way to think about it is that it's also how boards can recruit, and whatever you post is searchable for the whole world. And some companies like social issues, some do not. If you were to post something for the Planned Parenthood, you probably wouldn't get recruited onto the NRA's board. Neither is good or bad or right or wrong. It just means that you need to be clear about what it is that you're posting and know that that will 100% affect your board roles. And some people like that and some people don't. Just be prepared that it happens. It's out there. One thing that we'll talk about from the resume I should have mentioned earlier is omissions and exaggerations. It is really important that you don't have omissions or exaggerations on your resume. Whatever's on your resume needs to be on your LinkedIn. If a company is looking for you, you submit a resume, they go back and check your LinkedIn because that's what they should be doing. And there are variations there, there's going to typically be problems. If you have, if you say that you've got a degree from Harvard, but all you have is a certificate, that's not an omission, that's a lie. And I was on a board search where the candidate did not get placed because he was not clear about his degrees. So these are things that are really important. If you had a problem at a company and omit it and it comes up in a background check, if you get all the way through the process to the background check and that comes up, you can lose the board seat. So it's always better to be clear and upfront and get in front of any problems than have omissions or exaggerations. Okay, so number 5 is developing your social media presence. So again, just making sure that you're communicating online and in person your value. That social media presence can be really important if you're in California, so a board hasn't met you and they're in, I don't know, in New York City, and they want to understand who you are and how you engage in community. That social media presence. So again, things like LinkedIn, having your own website can be actually helpful. It's telling in terms of your ability to communicate or hire the right people to do the right thing for you in terms of your social media presence. And there are people who will do a social media whole profile and post and repost things for you. You can hire services like that, but just whatever it is, figure it out and make sure it's on brand for the boards you want and for the experience you have. So number 6 is about educating yourself on board fundamentals. I mentioned that the SEC had rules that are 30 rules last year alone that were up. These are changing all the time. Some of them are minor and irrelevant to the broader board conversation. Some of them are very niche and they're around audit, and some are really important things like sustainability is one of them they're looking at right now, reporting specifically for that. And then again, the cybersecurity rule that they passed a few months ago. Education is important. If you don't know what your fiduciary duties are, how could you possibly know if you're fulfilling them? And from a fiduciary duties perspective, if you don't fulfill them appropriately and with what we call the business judgment rule, or in good faith, essentially, then you can be not only sued, you can be sued for all of the money that you have, you can be criminally liable, you should have D&O insurance, but there are a number of things that can happen if you don't understand your fiduciary duties. So make sure you understand your fiduciary duties. Even if you're with a private company, there are sometimes either city or state or industry regulations that can apply. So make sure that you've got good counsel as far as that goes. And if you get recruited into a board of any kind, private, generally speaking, as a fiduciary of a board, even if it's private, if you're a fiduciary, which there are instances in which that happens, make sure you have D&O insurance or directors and officers liability insurance. And it typically is paid for by the company recruiting you. So again, understand the fundamentals. Insurance is one of them, and then stay current because it changes all the time. One of the things I think is really important is that as you work towards your first board seat or your next board seat, reading magazines or like HBR or the Wall Street Journal, things like that, that really focus on board oversight, board language, board reporting, is really helpful in changing your vocabulary to be able to really interview for board roles. So part of the conversation is being able to interview. You can get invited into the room. And let me just say that part of what I do is help boards interview when I'm working with them. So I've seen dozens of interviews go wrong. You can be invited into the room and not be able to communicate your skill sets from a board perspective and how you might help a board think about these issues. And so helping to read what's going on in the industry, what's changing, apply that to your skill sets can really help you get through the interview process. The next thing on there is about recruiters. So I am a recruiter. You should send me your resume. You should also get to know any other recruiter in the space. There are 7 top recruiters in the country that all have board offices that I know of. I'm sure there are many others that do as well, but I know the 7 top do. I've sat on panels with them. So you can Google them. It's like the Heidrick and Struggles and Russell Reynolds and Korn Ferry and Egon Zender. And I can't think of the rest of them, but just Google it. And so try and get your resume into board offices. Most cities, particularly more urban cities, have boutique recruiters that will either work only executive space, but will take board work as well, or that work at the board space specifically. So make sure that you reach out to them and share your value and share an updated resume, those kinds of things. And then make sure that you get yourself out there, that you've got, that you're communicating, that you're sharing your value, that you're moving forward with those kinds of things, that you are sharing, that you're prepared for board work, that you're demonstrating that you have board work, and that you're reading the materials that are relevant for board work. Let me pause for a minute before I go on and see if there are any questions.
Quiet group.
So I'm sorry, Cindy, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, come on, you guys. I'm sure you've got questions.
Well, you suggested reading like HBR and some of the different articles for getting your vernacular to the right words for the board discussion. I guess what other ideas or suggestions do you have there? Because that's one thing I've noticed with myself is that there is a transition from being that manager and operating and being that business speak versus that board conversation. And I'm trying to make that leap, but is there another suggestion besides reading that could complement that?
Well, I think Rochelle went out. I'm letting her back in. I think her computer must have crashed.
It did. I'm here. I'm sorry.
I thought it was me.
No, I heard something about HBR before it crashed.
No, I was just asking about something that complement the reading HBR or the other Wall Street Journal, et cetera, about the best way to get your vernacular to be board ready.
I mean, board education. So and Cindy, you and I have never had a deep dive into what your program consists of. But really, so when you understand what your fiduciary duties are, and there are really primarily 2, it's duty of care and duty of loyalty. And then there are subversions of that and all kinds of things that go underneath it and they're applied through legal standards. And so you can do things like if you were to go to Harvard's board program, it's like a week-long board program, they would send you a ton of case studies and then they talk through the case studies. And the reason they do that is because the case studies help to cement in your mind those 2 fiduciary duties and how they apply through different kinds of in different ways. Because it's like, when you come to these legal standards, the legal standard might be 5 words, but how they're applied could look 100 different ways. And so whatever that looks like, and maybe you could talk a little more about that, Cindy, whatever the education looks like, you can get it in a number of ways. You can read books on it. There's a ton of books on it. But really just understanding what that looks like, because once you understand that you're from the fiduciary duties perspective, when you're responsible for whatever happens at an organization from an oversight perspective, and you fulfill those duties by asking good questions, everything else comes a little more naturally. Does that make sense? And I can go a little further in if people are curious about that.
Rochelle, and let me just say this, our program is designed to be kind of the first place to start. We do a high level, the exclusive sessions we have every month are consultants and experienced board members that really are sharing high level fiduciary responsibilities, the topics that are talked about in the boardroom, so that it gives you a flavor of the things that you need to know about. But I would say going deeper, you need to go beyond our program into an NACD certification, or, you know, if you're really serious, you need to spend some additional dollars to go deeper into some of those things.
Yeah, I would have to say, you know, I just did this just to see what it was like. So I was at NACD when we were creating the program on the actual certification, and I teach governance. So part of what I do when I'm working with boards is teach fiduciary duties and governance. And I have a 2-hour session and I have a 2-day session. So it just depends on how deep you want to go. But as a top line sort of first step, if you want to check this out and see if this is something you want more information on, you get the discount with Cindy's group to Private Directors Association. And Private Directors Association, when you join, has a free certificate on private company corporate governance, but they review all the fiduciary duties. And it comes with a book that's pretty in depth. That's, again, this is all free. So it's like you could join Cindy, get your discount for PDA, which is only $400 anyway. So it's, you know, not a whole lot more than a decent dinner, and then be able to do the certification for free. NACD is great too. They are, from a research perspective, they are second to none. And it's done in kind of quick bite size. I say bite size, it's not a super intense 2-week course. It's done in bite size information in terms of all of their research. You can get the same research for a, you know, again, NACD is great. It's like $5,000, like $2,000 to join or something, and $5,000 for the certification after that. So that it's a lot heftier price tag. So, and then really, if you're going to do that, then I say that you really, if that's your goal and you want to go the NACD route, then you really need to go to Summit, because that's where a lot of the boards recruit from. So then you're like another $3,000 for Summit. So you need to spend $10,000 in at least 2 years to really get value out of the NACD structure. So if you have time and energy and money, do it. If you want to tiptoe in, try the PDA version and see how that works for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
So with the rest of the time we have, we can talk either about interviewing or interviewing skills or missteps. We can talk about branding, or we can talk more about fiduciary duties and positioning yourself. Why don't I see if somebody has a strong feeling?
I'm all for the branding side. I'm at the beginning steps, but others can say what they're looking at.
Perfect. Anyone else want to jump in?
And Rochelle, one of the things you might do, which when you talked about networking, in some past sessions, you gave some examples of what that looks like. And I remember it was some woman that chaired a fundraising for school. You know what? Because I think people think networking is going to coffee or whatever with people, but your definition and the examples you gave, I think, are really, really important for them to understand.
Yeah, so let me just start by, I mentioned nonprofit board roles and how they're important. One of the things about nonprofit boards is that what you choose to sit on, you might step back and look at the board. So let's just say you love two things. You love puppies and you love kids. You might go, okay, well, what role, what boards are around that look at puppies or look at kids? You might look at the organization to see how their structure is. You can also pull GuideStar information, but you might also look at who's on the board and figure out how you can, figure out who's on that board and decide if they're people that you want to be serving with and that you can demonstrate your value with in a way that's meaningful long-term. So that's sort of step one. Step two is, we talked a little bit about, I mentioned branding a little bit. I mentioned nonprofit board roles. One of the things that you need to do is whatever you decide to do, you need to do it well. So your brand will always precede you, always. And you can't go back and fix the things that you've done in the past, but what you can do is manage that moving forward. And so that means I always tell people to say yes to everything that they can in relation to board,
not just board work, but it's public speaking too. It's like the more that you help people, people want to help you. So in this particular instance, I have a colleague who's a board member. She's on a couple of public company boards now. And she had was a president of a division of a company. And she was wrapping up that work. She really wanted to join a board. And at the same time, she got asked to lead the ice skating committee for her country club for the kids that do something there. And that was the last thing she wanted to do, but she kind of got roped into doing it. And when she finally had to say yes, she decided that if she was going to do it, she was going to do one hell of a job. And so she worked really hard. She made everything perfect. She went way over the top. And when she was done, one of the dads was sitting next to her and said, "Wow, you just did an excellent job with this. I can't believe how well you X, Y, and Z." And she looked at them and said, "Great. Well, now that you know what I'm doing, I'm looking for a board role as well. So if you know any board members that are looking for new boards, any boards who are looking for new board members, let me know." And they said, "Oh yeah, I know a bank that does, and I think you might actually be a good fit." And so she was able, through doing a good job with an ice skating fundraiser for her local community, was able to get on a bank board. And that launched her career into being able to get on multiple other boards. And she was on that board for like 10 years. She was a president, not a CFO, and she was able to get onto the audit committee, chair the audit committee, work the bank through a transaction, and move on to other boards, because each one of these things builds the experience that somebody needs when they're joining boards. And so one of the things you want to mention, by the way, I mentioned getting on the treasury committee or becoming a CFO, et cetera. But one of the things you'll want to mention if you join a board are the committees in which you sit. So if you're on a private company and you're on a transaction committee, that can be helpful in the future. So even if you don't have all of the skill sets that somebody's looking for, you might have extra ones or not that can be valuable. And when all things are created equal, it's helpful to have the little extras included, particularly from a search perspective for me, and or for a board looking. And I mentioned before earlier that you needed to be thoughtful about people looking at your LinkedIn. The reality is I'm looking at LinkedIn all the time for, every recruiter is using LinkedIn at the board level. I am using it at the board level. And one of the things I'm looking for is if somebody's listed themselves as a board member, even if they have just a nonprofit board, having that you are a board member on your LinkedIn helps me understand that you're not just some schmo who got roped into something you didn't want to do, but actually that you're serious about your work, that it's something that you want to follow in your career, and that you're looking to build that portfolio. Nobody says no to board work. I mean, even if they say no, they recommend somebody else, or it's because they already have 4 other boards. It's not a corporate role. So you can have more than one, and people love to be asked. So when people have that board role listed, it means that they are able to, that I'm more likely to reach out to them, even if it's just for an interview, because I do a lot of writing as well. And so if I'm writing for a board magazine or for PDA or somebody else, and I'm looking to interview a candidate, if I see board member in their profile, if I'm looking to ask a question about technology or finance or CHRO, if I see board member in your profile, it means you're more likely to be able to answer the question from the perspective that I'm asking. And that puts your name then in front of a number of other board members as a leader in the space. So it's just another way to reinforce these processes and goals that you have to be able to join your next board. Is that helpful?
That's what I wanted to hear. I wanted you to expand on networking. One other question that I've heard, well, it's not really a question. I've heard people say to me, "Well, I'm a white male. I'm never going to find a board," right? And so I think you and I've actually talked about this. I'd love for you to share your perspective.
Sure. So I'll just get perspective and talk about data. So the data is that about 70, it was at the peak of recruiting to boards, when diverse recruiting, that means gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, was the absolute best. The peak was 39% of recruitments were diverse. So it has been at least 60% of candidates have been white men, and that number is actually shifting backwards from diversity, away from diversity. So we're now at about 75% of all board placements right now are white men. Now that changes a few points here and there, and I think that'll change long term, but I think for the next 10 years, the next 5 years especially, we're going to stay in this position that diversity, boards think diversity is important, and still most of the, I don't want to say Russell 3000, but it's something in the neighborhood of half of the Russell 3000 doesn't have any diverse candidates on it, something like that. The lower half typically. Diversity is the best. We see diversity at the best performing companies, which is, I think speaks some volumes. And diversity means different things. So I recruited a white man who was under 40 to a board because his age was diverse for that board in particular. I recruited American women to a Latino board because that was diversity. That's what diversity looked like for them. They were all Latino men. And so it depends on what you're looking at. Right now, we're talking, military is diverse. So if your military and can demonstrate that, that's a great skill. I am talking a lot about technology in the boardroom and how that looks, for them, for their skill set matrices, that can be a diverse perspective. So diversity isn't just about gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, which is important, but it's also the end goal for boards is to be able to have a different set of skills and a different way of thinking in the boardroom to ensure that people are receiving the highest level of information that is most supportive to helping that organization grow. So again, when you're thinking about your resume or your value proposition or your networking or how you might network with people, make sure that you're thinking about your skills from that perspective. And the T-shape matters, the deep functional role and high level oversight all matter. So just being prepared to communicate those skill sets, the functional role, revenue, special skills. We didn't talk a lot about special skills, so let me dive in a little bit there. Special skills are different to anyone. I mentioned I mentioned enterprise risk management. That can be one. Cybersecurity, AI is a hot one right now. These all change over time again, but it's really ways. It could be different kinds of integrations. It can be countries in which you've worked. I've worked with companies that they needed somebody who was an expat or had spent significant time in Germany or Japan. So saying a continent is not helpful because companies don't enter into continents, they enter into countries. So if you can find ways to list countries in which you've worked, that can be helpful. Special skills like for CHROs, like reduction in forces, while keeping morale and culture can be big things. Metrics matter. I talked about inputs and outputs, but metrics matter. I don't want to hear fluffy words that don't make any sense. And people need to be able to understand your skill sets as it relates to their needs, but they have to be able to remember it. And if you give me a list of adjectives with no nouns, I don't have anything to attach to. So part of the networking piece is really about being able to communicate your value in a way where I can say things. So here's an example. People say, oh, I worked through COVID. Well, everyone worked through COVID. What did you do that was different and memorable? And there, so some people, I was talking to somebody, they did a return, they did a return home and then a return to work for an essential business. And they were able to ensure that 90% people came back and that they had, like 90% engagement. That's incredible. Those two things don't exist at the same time in most companies. So that's something that you want to hold on to. It's harder with cost centers. So organizations like that are people who are CIOs or CISOs who aren't revenue driving, it can be hard to find metrics, but then you have to think about it differently. So maybe your metrics are about engagement or about retention because you were such a great leader that your team didn't turn over, or that you created technology that was so easy and seamless for implementation with 0 errors, or that you defended X amount of attacks, or supported the growth in other areas. And then something to think about from a long-term strategy is not just that you did these things. If you have time to be able to increase your resume, to take on new possibilities for your career, one of the things you want to think about is always getting a P&L. If you don't have a P&L, so CHROs, CIOs, CTOs, those kinds of things. And when I say CHRO, I mean there's all kinds of titles, right? CPO, CTO, whatever that looks like for your company. But go try and get a P&L. some of the CHROs I've placed have been easier to place because they had a P&L, and that helps them understand more holistically what the issues are with things like sales or P&L or distribution or supply chain or whatever. And same thing, if you're a CIO, CTO, CISO, and you haven't had a P&L, figure out how to work towards a P&L. Take a little more on. And I know that there are some social structures around taking more on, but that's really how people know that you're ready. When you say yes to speaking engagements, when you say yes to development planning, when you say yes to P&Ls, those are the kinds of things that help people understand that you're ready for board work versus, versus not having demonstrated that. If you can see somebody, and they tell you that they're ready versus showing you that you're ready, you're always going to believe the showing over the telling. So communicate what you've done in metrics in clear terms, use nouns, back off the adjectives. 1 is fine, 3 is not. And then make sure that you've been able to help demonstrate how you can help a company move forward. So back to the interviewing I mentioned earlier, one of the things you'll want to think about is when we talk about outcome-driven structures, what you want to say is something in the effect of, you led a team of 300, so that's the input, to increase sales threefold, that's the output. And so you understand sales challenges and oversight structures, which is why you'd be good to a board. That's the outcome for a board. So you're taking your input, you're making sure that you understand that there's value and metrics to it. And then you're helping a board understand how, from an oversight perspective, even though this was a doing, as an employee, you're a doer, how you can take the doing and translate it to oversight at the board level so that you can ask good questions of the executive team on a board in which you might sit to be able to add value. Let me see if there are any questions on that before I move on, because that can be very, it's a very specific way to think about board work and to translate your own personal skills.
I have a question that's about you just gave us a lot of information, and all of the information that we do, it takes up space, even if you get it to the smallest, quickest way of describing. So there's our board bio and there's our board resume. So is the goal to get that board bio to pique the interest enough that they will look at the resume where we've got more space to be able to put these metrics? And I know some metrics have to be in the bio, but more of the detail.
Great question. You always want to have both ready at the same time because you never know what somebody's going to ask for. So make sure they're both ready before you really start this journey. What I would say is the bio should be no more than a page, and it should have a picture on it. It's more like a speaker's bio, but board work is really up top, so highlighted. And typically you'll have 2 or 3 of your most interesting metrics in your bio. So that's the peak, because you're like, oh, so interesting. They tripled revenue in 1 year. How'd they do that? The resume should be at least 3 pages. 3 pages is really ideal. 2 is probably not enough if you're looking for a board role. 4 can be okay because you've done enough things that you're prepared for board work. Depends on the person and their background, but 5 is generally too much. I've done a couple of, so I do resume building for particular at the board level for candidates as one of my services. And I've only done a couple of 5-page resumes, and it was because the person's skill set was so interesting and different. There was no other way to do it. And we had to build, like entrepreneurs will have longer resumes usually because they've done really interesting, weird things. And we have to be able to demonstrate that they were successful and not having a nap on their parents' couch, which is what people think if you don't demonstrate metrics. For those of you that are consultants in that same vein, you want to divide your work into so that you talk about building the business in which you're in and then the types of clients you were helping. So back to the metrics, and I'm sorry, let me finish that question, which is that, yes, a little bit in your resume, a little bit in your bio, a lot in your resume, and it doesn't matter. You have to always have both because usually they want both. And if you were to join like PDA, for example, they have board postings on their site. So when you join, you have access to all of their postings. I am seeing most companies are asking for both the resume and the bio. And I think part of the problem is people perceive those words differently. Not everyone thinks a bio is a bio and a resume is a resume. And so I think they want both for that reason. And some people's resumes are amazing and some people's are terrible, and some people's bios are amazing and some are terrible. So if you're seeing board postings that are requesting a resume and a bio, which is more the norm, you can send them both and let them choose what they want. But it works the same way. It has to be quick information that clearly gets to the point, that explains what a great executive you are. And I always think of Mark Twain's quote, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long letter instead. You have to be able to cut to the most effective, most important information that is board oriented. And so I was having a conversation with the CHRO yesterday. She was hyper focused. She was so excited about all of this values work. She worked with the executives for like 2 years. They did a big listening tour. It was like the majority of her work for 2 years were values, focusing on values. I mean, that's like a half of a sentence for a board, because it's sort of important. At the end of the day, their job is to approve and to vet and to make sure that things are happening appropriately. But the data in her transition work, in her technology transition, and her integration was way, way, way more important than a board. And if we get to a point where we're at 5 pages, then we have to start making cuts. And so if that's the case, make the cuts on the things that are less important around, I don't need 3 lines on values, a half a bullet is fine. And again, that doesn't matter if you can't track the effect. So some people will say things like, they relaunched values and revamped the culture. Well, how do you know that? Where are the metrics that tell you that that was effective, that your work wasn't all for naught? Was it your engagement scores? Great. Was it retention? Great. Was it recruiting? Great. Whatever that looks like, there has to be an output that supports that work. Any other questions? I know we've got about 2 minutes left. Okay. Well, Cindy, you're welcome to share that slide. I had one more slide in that deck, and it was just said to be patient, be persistent, and get support, because it is a long journey. It does take time. You have to keep working at it. Finding an advocate is great. Again, I'll make sure that Cindy has information to send out, but I work with people on resumes, again, reverse search. And then I also work with boards on governance structures, on fiduciary duty, cybersecurity. I have a whole list of things on my website that you'll be able to go look at if you have any questions. And regardless, connect with me on LinkedIn, because I am connected to 4,000 other board members, and it's a great way for you to start integrating into that social media process and communicating and sharing and commenting on other people's statuses, and being able to share your own to demonstrate yourself as somebody prepared for board work.
So Rochelle, thank you. See, I told you she was amazing, guys. She's a great resource. Please take advantage. I will copy her on the follow-up email that I send out to everyone. And I'll also send you guys the link to our ESA website. So if you're interested in looking at our program and signing up, it's an easy click and you're right in there. But we really appreciate you being here. And Rochelle, as always, you're amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And please take advantage of contacting Rochelle and sending her your resume. Okay? Okay, guys, thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Cindy. Bye.
Bye.